Hi, and welcome back. Today, we're going over mixing, panning, polarizing, and creating feedback patches within your modular system, all by utilizing Papomi from Metabolic Devices. First, we'll go over the module and its functionality, and then we'll dive into a series of patches, starting with some simple ones and getting more creative along the way. If you'd like to support this video series, or you want to get access to the PDF sheets of the illustrations I use in this and many of my other videos, have a look at my Patreon. But now, let's dive right in. This is the Metabolic Devices Papomi, a utility module that combines a lot of handy functions in one. It's easiest to understand it if we start by dividing it into two sections. The lower half, visualized with the gray lines, contains a simple mixer setup with three inputs, suitable for both audio and control voltages. The first one is a direct unity input. The second and third input both have a bipolar attenuator, meaning you can mix the input at full strength, fully clockwise, attenuate the input to 0 at 12 o'clock, and if you go further counterclockwise, you start to invert the signal until it reaches input strength again, but inverted. Then there is a bipolar DC offset control right here that allows you to add a continuous offset voltage to your mix, from -10 to 10 volt. And finally, there's a mix output here. This is the result of the three inputs and the DC offset. The upper half of the module is a voltage control panner and polarizer in one. This section has its own input, again suitable for both audio and control voltages. Then the outputs on the left and right can be used to pan the input signal. With the center knob in the middle, both outputs have the input signal at 50%. Fully clockwise, the right output is at 100% and the left output is at 0. And fully counterclockwise, the left output is at 100% and the right at 0. Then there is a CV input to control the main knob, so you can easily sweep your input between the two outputs with control voltages. And this input comes with a bipolar attenuator as well. The polarizer output, here on the top in the middle, is controlled in the same section. It shares the same input, CV input with attenuator and control knob, and both functions always operate simultaneously. The polarizer output outputs the input signal in a regular way when the control knob is fully clockwise. It's attenuated to 0 with the knob at 12 o'clock and outputs a fully inverted signal when the knob is fully counterclockwise. This gives you the possibility to have audio or CV go through 0, or use it as a voltage-controlled attenuator, or in other words, a polarizer. Finally, this section here needs some attention. Both the mixer and panner section can be used completely separately, because the mixer has its own output and the polarizer has its own input. However, the output of the mixer is normalized to the panner's input, so you can use the mixer section as the input for the panner section. When you use the input here, the connection between the two sections is broken, but when you use the mixer's output, the signal is still passed on to the panner's input. This gives you the possibility to use the module for a variety of basic functions, as well as creative feedback patches. Mixing is the most common function of this module, but it's an absolute crucial element in a modular system. In a basic modular voice, for example, a mixer is often used to mix different oscillators and perhaps a noise source together, so the mixed audio can be sent to a filter and a VCA to complete a simple monosynth setup. The bipolar attenuators can be useful here, for example if you have two oscillators with saw waves in different directions. This way you can invert one and avoid phase cancellation. Or perhaps you have two similar ones and actually like to play with different tunings and create phase cancellation. I also often use audio mixers in complex or live patches. For example, when I use a few different sound sources like sample players and drum modules to create a drum bus and send the mix off to an effects chain. But because you're able to use the mixer for control voltages as well, it pretty much has endless uses. For example, when you have a simple oscillator, filter, VCA voice, and you want to use a gate with an envelope to open that VCA, but you want to mix in a bit of tremolo created by an LFO as well. Or you want to use that envelope to modulate the filter, but at the same time you want to add a subtle amount of slow random voltage, as well as some audio rate modulation from the oscillator in your main voice, which is a great way to add texture. Mixing different control voltages within your modular system is often what creates dynamic patches. And the two bipolar attenuators as well as the DC offset gives you the possibility to control your voltages in detail. For example, if you have a bipolar LFO, you can attenuate and apply some offset to it in case you like to modulate a digital module that only responds to positive voltages between 0 and 5 volt. The panner is where things become more dynamic. Let's start with a simple stereo patch. You can just feed an audio signal from a simple voice with some modulation into the panner input, and use something like a simple sine wave LFO to sweep the audio from left to right, and use the bipolar attenuator to adjust the amount of stereo spread. Or you can create interesting stereo patches by multiplying one oscillator to two different filters to create a left and right stereo audio signal. Then feed the Papomi a control voltage made with a steady clock and a short attack decay envelope, and have that panned between the two filters with a smooth random voltage. Very often, it's interesting to experiment with both slow as well as audio rate modulation. In this patch, for example, you can replace the smooth random voltage with another tuned oscillator, and add a sequencer or keyboard to control the 1 volt per octave of both oscillators. This creates a more continuous fat stereo sound. You can also use a panner to sweep an audio source, like a synth voice or perhaps a nice drum loop, between two different effects. For example, one with a fast delay and some distortion, and the other a slower one with some pitch shifting. Again, using a slow sine wave to pan the signal. In this case, it could be fun to use a CV sequencer instead of the random voltage, so you can actually dial in the exact panning amount, or in other words, effect routing you want for each step. And instead of using it to divide an audible sound source, you can achieve interesting effects by panning a modulation source to different places within your patch. For example, again with our simple voice, used as a continuous drone. You can take an audio rate waveform, send it to the panner, and use a modulation source like an envelope or LFO to pan that signal between the filter and the oscillator's frequency CV input. Some other quick ideas are to use a panner to pan a simple modulation source like a sequencer between two completely different voices. Or if you feed the panner an offset voltage, use a slow random voltage to pan the signal and send the outputs to two VCAs to control the volume of two sounds. When you do this, you create a nice organic volume balance. Besides for panning, the upper section of the Papomi can be used as a polarizer. A simple way to demonstrate this is to send a simple looping envelope through the polarizer to the filter in a simple voice. If you set the control knob at 12 o'clock and you use a bipolar sine wave LFO to modulate the polarizer, that envelope will sweep between being a positive and negative signal, or in other words, opening and closing the filter. Also in this mode, getting the control knob and modulation attenuator right is important. For example, if you use the same setup but like the envelope to have a continuous positive effect, you can turn the control knob clockwise. Then, if you want to use a sequencer with an attack hold decay envelope to sweep the input signal to negative, you use the bipolar attenuator on the modulation input to invert the incoming envelope. In this patch, there's a modular clock driving a clock divider. A fast division is used to drive a percussive module and a slower division to trigger a kick. Then there's a simple constant baseline made with an oscillator and a filter. To create some movement in this patch, you can use a square wave LFO synced to a somewhat faster clock division as an input for the polarizer. Then a sine wave LFO tempo synced to a slower clock division to modulate the Papomi. Finally, the polarizer's output is sent to the filter, so the square wave LFO creates a shifting accent. And while this patch is going, you might as well use both the panning outputs to modulate some parameters on the percussive module, which is making some hats. The knob settings and voltages used are again important when you use the polarizer with audio. If you feed an audio rate signal like a sine wave to the input and set the control knob to 12 o'clock, there is no output signal. So if you use a positive signal like an ADSR envelope, you will only get positive amplification of the input signal and use the polarizer as a simple VCA. But when you use a bipolar LFO, like a sine wave in this setup, the output signal will have a positive amplification during the positive part of the sine LFO and negative amplification or inverted amplification during the negative part of the sine wave LFO. This way, the polarizer functions as a ring modulator, which can lead to interesting sounds if you use two audio rate signals. All of these basic functions are very useful on their own, but the combination of these functions makes the Papomi very suitable for creative experiments and feedback patches. Just to introduce the concept of working with feedback, let's set up a simple no-input mixing patch. We don't feed the module any audio, but instead take the left pan output, send it through a delay and then a high pass and a low pass filter and then back to one of the inputs. By controlling the main knob, you can send more audio to the left output, and with the input attenuator, you can control the amount of signal that is sent back to the panner section. This way, it's easy to create a feedback loop that goes round and round. However, because the sound is altered with the delay and filters, every time it passes through, you can sculpt the character of the sound. You can expand this no-input patch by using the right output to create a second feedback loop, for example through the clouds in pitch shifting mode, and a bandpass filter. Just by controlling the knobs on the Papomi, filters and effects, you can guide the audio and create different feedback loops by hand. Now, let's use the same concept, but in a more controlled automated patch. In this case, we do feed a constant drone made with a single oscillator and filter into the unity input. Then, the same two feedback loops with some different settings are used, but this time the panner is controlled with a slow random voltage, sweeping the audio between the feedback loops. This way, you can create self-playing ambient or drone feedback patches. You can experiment with different effects to change the sound, and expand as much as you like. In the next example, I use the same basic patch, but with some different settings and a few simple LFOs to bring extra movement in the feedback loops. Beside all the basic functions, these feedback patches are really interesting to explore. And I might go more in depth with this with different examples in the future. So if you want to see more modular content from me, smash that like, subscribe and bell button. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching and see you next time.